Good morning. Why we just wait a minute for maybe some other people to join us? Why don't you say hello, and we will get started presently here. Uh, so I appreciate you being here this morning, and we're looking forward to a good lesson from C.S. Lewis, and hopefully it'll be good for you. So, okay. So and this is so. If you would say hello. I just want to remind everybody who might be listening later to share this video with others. Um, this is a nuanced nuanced story of sorts, and so it gets at some of the more subtler things that are in our lives, particularly as it relates to this particular temptation and how it can be alive in our life. And because it's alive in our life, then it is oftentimes shared, often unwittingly, with other people. So there are a whole bunch of passages of scripture that relate to this particular chapter. It's pretty endless, and not only just in terms of directly in terms of the subject itself, but all kinds of stories and parables throughout the scriptures, anecdotes of this particular sin that all of us struggle with in whatever way that we do, but we struggle with it. And so I think the key verse here, because there are a whole host of other ones, but the one that encapsulates it, that gets, that's the dominant theme here, I would say, is Proverbs 16:18. Certainly one that's worth memorizing. In fact, this particular proverb is so apparent and so popular that it even crosses over into the world in general, that even the world, people devoid of the Christian faith, quote this parable or this Proverbs rather regularly. So it's kind of interesting how true it must be for people of all stripes. So in Proverbs 16:18, we read where Solomon says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So obviously, when you look at that particular text, and in true wisdom literature fashion, there's a primary theme or thesis that's stated, and then there's a follow-up theme or thesis that's similar to it in order to underscore its importance and its significance. So here we read, pride goes before destruction. And so a person whose mindset, and this, and the implication here is they are structured, their mind, there's a habit, there's it's pride is systemic in their framework of how they review, see other people, see certain situations and things like that. So in the first statement, pride goes before destruction. The implication there is that pride is systemic, it's embedded, it's innate, it's just a part of the way in which they think. In the second theme of that particular, or second statement of that particular verse, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So the haughty spirit is the outworking of that systemic nature that is impacted by pride, or that systemic nature that's been shaped by pride. So understand then that a lot of the sin that we have in life shapes our mental framework and our behavior in an autonomic sort of fashion, and we don't even realize it. So it's really so much a part of us that we don't really fully appreciate how much of a part it is in our framework. A haughty spirit is the outworking of that. It's the haughty spirit would be impossible were that framework not really there. So the framework is structured in such a way that it gives permission for that. So that's what is really going on there. And so there are other passages, Galatians 6:4, James 4:10, Jeremiah 9:23, Philippians 3. You could do a search online through DuckDuckGo, other search engines, and there's just a list. I mean, people just have a ton of things put on there where there's this compilation of Bible verses having to deal with pride. Why? Because it's such an issue in the human experience. It's such a big deal. It's so much of what we are that we don't realize it is what we are. So I would say that Proverbs 16:18 then captures or encapsulates in the broadest yet most poignant way possible what we're talking about when it comes to pride. And so I hope you will find that to be helpful. So we begin then in chapter 24 with Screwtape writing Wormwood. My dear Wormwood, I have been in correspondence with Screwtape, who is in charge of your patient's young woman. So now this woman has a demon, her own personal kind of demon, tempter, and his name is Screwtape. And begin to see the chink in her armor. It is an unobtrusive little vice, which she shares nearly with all women who have grown up in an intelligent circle, united by a clearly defined belief, and it consists in a quite untroubled assumption that the outsiders who do not share this belief are really too stupid and ridiculous. And so he's saying, look, there's this there's this little prideful chink in her armor where, she's grown up in such a vibrant community of faith, where people, and apparently in this particular set that she belongs to, are very, very well educated and really, really well, very, very well educated and very intelligent. And so this has become so much a part of the norm for her that it morphs a little bit. It allows a little bit for her to regard others who don't belong to this kind of faith in the way that she does. It kind of gives her permission to see them in a bit more of a prideful way, that they are not like her. They are not as informed as she is. Those kinds of things. And so I just want to double check something here to make sure that. So in any case, that's what's going on there. So he goes. So then he goes on to say, he says the males. Here we go. The males who habitually meet these outsiders do not feel that way. Their confidence, if they are confident, is of a different level. Hers, which supposes to be due to faith, is in reality largely due to the mere color she has taken from her surroundings. And so so this prideful component in her life, what she believes to be is the confidence that she feels about her faith that manifests itself in a kind of pride, she believes is due to her faith. But in reality, it's just that people are different. And it's a subtle thing, but it's a little thing here that Lewis is trying to not Lewis, but Screwtape is trying to capitalize on. So here we go. It is not, in fact, very different from the conviction she would feel at the age of 10 that the kind of fish knives used in her father's house were improper, were proper or normal, or quote real, end quote, kind, while those of the neighboring families were not real fish knives at all. So none of us have any real experience with fish knives mostly, but what he's saying is, look, there are all kinds of things that are very common in our house that we have, that we've accepted as being common and and useful and good and even right. And anybody who doesn't have that, they just don't, they're just not as informed. They don't have the right kind of thing. We have this argument all the time over like which vehicle, Ford or Ford or Chevy, or what kind of ATV we might like, what kind of um, phone. So I mean, there are debates all the time whether or not it should be a Galaxy or whether it should be an Apple. Uh, those kinds of things, because people grew up with them, that it's always been this kind of thing. There's been this kind of commitment to that kind of thing. The assumption that people draw from that, then it must be the best thing. And therefore, if you go to another house or to another person and they have something different, then we are tempted to think in a prideful fashion, well, they don't have what we have, therefore they are not as informed. And so pride enters in, and we see them as a little less than what we might see them otherwise. So that's what he's saying here. Now, the element of ignorance and naivete in all this is so large, and the element of spiritual pride so small, that it gives us little hope of the girl herself. But have you thought of how it can be made to influence your own patient? So what he's saying here is that that pride is not only an issue in her, but because of her solid faith, it's just a it's a very small kind of thing that hasn't fully flowered, but it's present enough that it could influence others and tempt them to be like her, but yet not as resilient to it as she is. So does that make sense? So how, Screwtape is asking, can we take even this small element of pride in this young woman and export it into the life of the patient in a way that he cannot control it like she can, that it really can consume him, even though it hasn't consumed her. So, I mean, I think that he reveals a truth here that is not only real when it comes to pride, but any kind of sin that we have in life. That there are those of us that, we may not struggle with certain kinds of sins as much as another person, but we may have just enough of that sin that it can be exported into the lives of other people around us and make them susceptible to it in ways that we might be really more or less immune to its larger, more destructive effects because of our spiritual maturity and things like that. So, number one, we're never done ridding ourselves of sin and its footprint in our life. And number two, we have to be aware of the kind of sin that we have in our life, and its potential impact on people around us. Remember in the Song of Solomon's, where he talks about the little foxes, that it's the little foxes that destroy the grapevine, that oftentimes it's the little sins that can trip not just us up, but other people up, because they can't handle that kind of temptation as well as we've been handling ours. We may, in fact, have had a lot of pride at one time, and we've done a better and better job over life, so that its impact upon our life is relatively small. But still, when people pick up the trajectory of our sin, however they see it, even though it's gone down, it's still enough there to impact them into in a way that's corrosive, in a way that can corrupt them, because they are not as resilient to it. That's what Lewis is saying here. It is always the novice who exaggerates. The man who has risen in society is over refined. The young scholar is pedantic. So pedantic, pedantic is a word that where you overly emphasize big, flowery. You take on airs. It's that kind of a word. In this new circle, your patient is a novice, so he's new to these kinds of people. He is there daily, meeting Christian life of a quality he has never imagined, and seeing it all through an enchanted glass because he is in love. So Lewis, and I gotta wonder if this has not been his experience, as a young believer, that I'm not sure about the woman, but I am fairly certain that it's true that he did encounter many really highly educated Christians, um, probably the kind of Christians he didn't think existed before. So Tolkien, for example, was the one who wrote Lord of the Rings, had a profound impact upon Lewis's spiritual faith, as did another guy named George MacDonald. While I would not ascribe to all of George MacDonald's theology, he was a Christian and he had a strong impact upon Lewis's faith. All these people were scholars, and who were colleagues and taught him, I think, in his faith in powerful ways. And so I think that he's written a little bit of his own biography in here. I think the other piece of that that's really encouraging is that it ought to be encouraging to us is that really, and I said this many times in the past, is that Christians ought to be among the most informed, the, uh, the most well educated, the wisest people on the planet. I think that we are under that obligation. I think that um, we are called to imitate Christ. And if Christ is all knowing, if he is wise, then we are obligated to imitate him in whatever way that we possibly can. Now, I get that not everyone is a scholar, not everyone is bookish, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to learn and to gain wisdom. And, chief among the ways in which we gain wisdom, according to James, is to simply pray for it. And if we pray for it, God is faithful and he will give us wisdom, a supernatural kind of wisdom and insight and intuition and perspective that goes beyond not only their years, but their education. So I think that, Lewis is kind of highlighting subtly here the importance of informed, intelligent Christian community. And that's what the kind of thing that this young woman belonged to. And so he's saying, look, this patient now is a part of her community, and he didn't even think that it could exist, and he wasn't even sure that he could be a part of that. And so he's kind of blinded by it all. And how can we capitalize on that? So then he goes on to say, he is anxious. Indeed, the enemy commands him to imitate this quality of being informed, right, and intelligent. Can you get him to imitate this defect in his mistress and to exaggerate it until what is venial in her becomes in him the strongest and the most beautiful of the vices, spiritual pride? So, this is the central theme right here in this particular chapter. Can you get him to imitate this defect, this small defect in her? Can you get him to imitate it in him and to amplify it until what is venial, so a relatively harmless thing in her, becomes in him the strongest and most beautiful of the vices, spiritual pride? So I think Lewis would argue, that pride is the center, it's the core of all of our sins. There are a lot of theories about that. Milton has something to say about it in Paradise Lost and in Pilgrim's Progress. Pride and selfishness are all. And I do want to say this. Somebody who was anti-Christian, who had no use for it in many respects, Friedrich Nietzsche, believed that power was the basic drive in all of humanity. Some people believe it's selfishness. Some people believe it's pride. Power is an interesting one. The drive for power over others and for control of yourself. But I always thought that there's like a trifecta there, that if you have power here and pride here and selfishness here, that you can't actually exercise selfishness, pride, or power in this triangle. You can't exercise any of those without using the other two. Can't. That if I exercise power, it's because I have self-interest and because I believe I deserve it. If I exercise pride, it's because I am entitled. I am better than, and therefore I should get what I want, selfishness, and therefore I will exercise power to get it. And then, of course, if I exercise selfishness, then on some level I have to believe that what I want I deserve and somebody else doesn't. And in order for me to get it, I have to exercise power that usually harms or corrupts somebody else as a result of that. So it seems to me that there's this trifecta. There may be some others, but it seems to me and that it's a dynamic, right? That these are not static, but they are working each other in that way. So in some respects, then the corollary to that, the antonym or corollary to that would be that here is God, who is the center of power, right? And here is you, and here is another person. God, you, and another person. What we understand about the Greek term koinonia, which means fellowship, is that there's fellowship between God and you, and there's fellowship between God and this other believer, and there's fellowship between you two, and that is a dynamic, right? It's not static. It's always working some energy in some fashion, and that in whatever way that I enter into that loving fellowship, I am loving God, and in whatever way I am loving this other person, then I am loving them as God would love them, and if they love God, then they are loving me. So there's this dynamic that happens. And it seems to me there's kind of like this opposite, this corollary that is an opposite of the one that I described earlier with power, selfishness, and pride. In any case, according to Lewis, the most beautiful of all vices is spiritual pride. Spiritual pride, not just pride, not just secular pride, but spiritual pride. And the church has a lot to answer for with how much spiritual pride there is. And I mean, I'm sure that I've exercised more than my fair share of it over the course of my lifetime, but I've also observed this through many a televangelist and in among clergy. The kingdom thing that exists within the church. That many pastors, it's about not building the kingdom through their church, but it's about their church being a kingdom for them. And I just think that that's such a huge thing in the church today. The celebrity pastor is a big deal, and so we have a lot of we have a lot of repenting to do there, all of us. I mean, how many pastors, how much of our church leadership do what they do for attention, to be affirmed, and not because it's directly related to what advances the kingdom. So there's so much more that could be said about that. But this whole idea of spiritual pride has tripped us up and has caused tremendous um, problems for us today. And so I just, I just think that until we find a way to deal with it better than what we have, um, we're really going to continue to struggle in this culture. He goes on to say, the conditions seem ideally favorable. The new circle in which he finds himself is one which he is tempted to be proud of for many reasons, other than its Christianity. It is a better educated, more intelligent, more agreeable society than any he has yet encountered. So, a friend set, so that it is a better educated, um, a more intelligent and agreeable community, right, than any that he's encountered. So, the fact that they would include him could tempt him to be prideful. Under Okay, he is also under some degree of illusion as to his own place in it. Under the influence of love, he may still think himself unworthy of the girl, but he is rapidly ceasing to think himself unworthy of others. So, so there's a switch that's taking place, that because he belongs to this group, he's beginning to think that others are more unworthy of him, to reverse a little bit, to take it from the opposite angle of what Lewis is saying here, but the same truth. He has no notion how much in him is forgiven, because they are charitable and make the best of, because he is now one of the family. He does not dream how much of his conversation, how many of his opinions are recognized by them all as mere echoes of their own. So he's imitating them, he's replicating them. He thinks it's uh, he thinks it's original to himself, but it's not. He's just imitating them. Still less does he suspect how much of the delight he takes in these people is due to the erotic enhancement which the girl, for him, spreads over all her surroundings. So, because of his other interests in her in that way, it kind of blinds him, and that pride works itself out into others. So, it blinds him to certain things. He thinks that he likes their talk and way of life because of some congruity between their spiritual state and his, when in fact they are so far beyond him that if he were not in love, he would be merely puzzled and repelled by much of which he now accepts. So he is so blinded by his own insecurities, potentially. He is so blinded by his love and his, erotic distraction, that he really can't see himself. And so what he's really doing in many respects is he's parroting them. And so if he really could see how he really was, then he would see that he really is not nearly as mature as they are. And in fact, many of the ways in which they are mature, he would find maybe to be offensive, because he's just not there yet. He just doesn't. He just hasn't accommodated that mature kind of belief into his life yet. So he's kind of deluded, is what Screwtape is saying here, but doesn't realize it. He is like a dog which should imagine it understood firearm. I'm sorry. He is like a dog which should imagine it understood firearms, because its hunting instinct and love for its master enable it to enjoy a day's shooting. So for many people, I mean, this metaphor is beyond them, but he's just saying, look, just because Just because there's this hunting dog that enjoys hearing firearms shooting doesn't mean it's the same as hunting itself, or that they even begin to understand the nature of firearms themselves. It's just, it's a dog. Those are firearms. That's the purpose of firearms. And the dog doesn't really understand that. Here is your chance. While the enemy, by means of sexual love and of some very agreeable people far advanced in his service, is drawing the young barbarian up to levels he could never otherwise have reached. So God is bringing him into this community and into a kind of maturity, a group that is really mature that he could never get to himself. But it's important how he processes how he's being brought into that community, right? You must make him feel that he's finding his own level, that these people are his sort, and that coming among them, he has come home. When he turns from them to other society, he will find it dull. So when he leaves that community, that friend set, that friend group, and goes to other people, he finds them to be dull and to be uninteresting. So they are not like him, right? They don't have the right kinds of beliefs and actions. And so, therefore, they can be dismissed. They don't have to be regarded as image of the Imago Dei, images of God. So he goes on to say, partly because almost any society within his reach is, in fact, much less entertaining, but still more because he will miss the enchantment of the young woman. You must teach him to mistake this contrast between the circle that delights and the circle that bores him for the contrast between Christians and unbelievers. So, and so this contrast between other people who are not like his friend set, they are that way simply because they are unbelievers. They are that way in part because they are unbelievers. But just because they don't share all of the unique things that this friend set he has, doesn't mean then they should be dismissed. Doesn't mean that because they don't share where they like to vacation, they don't share what kind of cars they like to buy, they don't share because of books they like to read, that makes them innately bad people just because of that. So that's what Lewis is saying there. He must be made to feel, he'd better not put into words, how different we Christians are. And by, quote, we Christians, he must really, but unknowingly mean my set. And by my set, my community, he must not mean the people who, in their charity and humility, have accepted me, but the people with whom I associate by right. So this is a complex sentence, and I want to unpack it for you. So I'm going to read it again. So Screwtape says to Wormwood, I want you to make him feel the following thing, but I don't want him to say these words, because these words could very well lead him into a different direction. He must be made to feel, he better not put it into words, and these are the words, how different we Christians are. Because if you're a mature believer, you think, well, okay, we are different because of these important biblical principles, because of these Christ-like attributes. I don't want him to feel like that. I don't want him to think that. I don't want him to put those into words, says Screwtape to Wormwood. Rather, we Christians, when he says we Christians, we must really be, but unknowing, how different we Christians are. And by we Christians, he must really, but unknowingly mean my community, my set. He must not mean my friend set. They're very loving, they're very kind, they're very godly. I don't want him to make those kinds of comparisons between people who are not like that, because then he'll see the beauty of Christ-likeness in their faith, and he'll see that not in them, and that contrast will be destructive to Satan, is what Wormwood is saying. Well, what I really want him to think is that the people who in their charity and humility have accepted me, but the people with whom I associate by right. In other words, I belong to these people. They and they have incorporated me into their community, and because I'm a believer, then I belong to them, and these people do not belong. They can never belong, and they shouldn't belong, and we don't want him thinking that way, is what Screwtape is saying. Success here depends on confusing him. Explicitly and professedly proud of being a Christian, you will probably fail. The enemy's warnings are too well known. If, on the other hand, you let the idea of, quote, we Christians, end quote, drop out altogether and merely make him complacent about his friend group, his set, you will produce not true spiritual pride, but mere social vanity, which by comparison is trumpery in punny little sin. What you want is to keep a sly self-congratulation mixing with all his thoughts and never allowing him to raise the question, what precisely am I congratulating myself about? So you have this young man who's relatively young in his faith, who's fallen in love with this wonderful girl, who has incorporated her into her family and their community that are all well educated, thoughtful. He's pinching himself because he can't believe that he's been brought into that. And then what Screwtape is saying is, whenever he makes comparisons between that new group he belongs to, never allow him to make those comparisons based on their godliness and their goodness, but rather that make the comparisons about things that really don't matter, and that he is entitled by belonging to that group, and he could never belong or be a part of or allow or participate or love these other groups that are out there that are not godly, that are not Christian. And so this is the whole idea of pride. And so he's congratulating himself that he belongs to this group. And he's really, really glad that he doesn't belong to any of these groups, not because they aren't Christian or believers, but simply because they don't do the same kinds of things that this group does. So it's a very subtle thing, but I think I've seen that at work a fair amount in my life. The idea of belonging to an inner ring, of being in a secret, is very sweet to him. Play on that nerve. Teach him, using the influence of this girl when she is silliest, to adopt an air of amusement at the things that unbelievers say. So amusement rooted in pride. Some theories, so I've seen this a fair amount when Christians talk about non-Christians, and those non-Christians take certain positions that, sort of ideologically, I've seen those Christians almost try to call down, fire on these particular Christians. I can think of 3 different times in the New Testament where James and John struggled with spiritual pride. One of the times was when they were going through a village and the village refused them, and James and John approached Jesus and said, do you want us to call down fire on them and destroy this village because they rejected you? And so there was a component of spiritual pride there that was really horrific. It would have been horrific for that village. Another time was when the mother of James and John came to Jesus and said, look, they've left everything, so I want you to promise me that you will let one sit at your right hand and the other to sit at your left hand. And so they would have gotten an elevated position, not only over the rest of the world, but over the other disciples as well. And so there's another example of spiritual pride, even among the apostles. There's a third one that escapes my memory at the time, at the moment, but there are three examples of when that happened. And it's kind of buried, hidden in there, but it's there. And I think it's very instructive for us. So play on that nerve. Teach him, using the influence of the girl when she is silliest, to adopt an air of amusement at the things the unbelievers say. Some theories which he may meet in modern Christian circles may here prove helpful. Theories, I mean, that place in the hope of society, in some inner ring of clerks, some trained minority of theocrats. Well, I mean, and those people are all over the place. These little kingdom people, like if you don't think, you don't believe like we do, then you can't possibly be Christian. You're not there, you're not mature. By the way, there's an element of this within almost every major faith tradition. So I just want to make a note here. So in theological traditions, we do this very same thing. So, in fundamentalism, there's a certain amount of, look, we sent our kids to a Christian school, and there was no shortage of spiritual pride there. So it was interesting how much conversation would take place about how one parent would say to another parent, or parents, that their child never struggled with this kind of sin or these sins. And, of course, it was always reflective then of the kind of parenting that was being done. And that's true and untrue, right? So, as I recall back on that, it was always interesting to us how much control some of those parents would exercise over the life of their children, so that even if they wanted to sin in certain ways, it would have been impossible for them to do that because they had no opportunity. Most of us who are virtuous are not virtuous because that's who we really are. We are virtuous because we've lacked the opportunity to do otherwise, right? So there's a certain amount of pride, in the lives of Christians, where they would say, "Well, I've never struggled with that. I never had that kind of sin in my life." Well, you may not have ever had the opportunity for that kind of sin in your life, and that, in some ways, that could be a very good thing. But in other ways, there are some Christians who are so otherworldly that they reduce their ability to do anything really good in life. So they won't. I mean, I remember, in one of the churches that I was a part of while I was growing up, that there were all these places you weren't supposed to go to and to be at, right? So you would go to a service and the pastor would challenge you to lead people to Christ. But if you were at places where there were people who were not Christians, then you could be judged for being in a place where people were not Christians. I mean, it was you got it from both ends there. Like, okay, well, how can I lead somebody to Jesus if you don't want me to be with people who don't know Jesus? How's that possible? So there are those people, like, there are people like that. In other theological traditions, for example, in the Reformed tradition, you are considered to be spiritually mature if you can cite and are familiar with the Westminster Confession of Faith. If you know that, right? If you know Reformed faith, then it's assumed that you are a mature believer. In Roman Catholicism, parents take great pride in their children who participate in all 7 of the sacraments. And if you participate in all 7 of the sacraments, then you are perceived as being spiritually mature. And so there's a lot of pride that's associated with that. I mean, really, the list is endless. I mean, in many of the community-oriented churches that I've been a part of, you are considered to be spiritually mature if you know the Bible, if you've memorized it a lot, if you can talk intelligently about it. Well, there are all kinds of people out there that know a lot about the Bible that can talk intelligently about any number of things, but they aren't even believers. I mean, the vast majority of people who are theologians who study the Christian faith aren't even Christian. They just study it as a discipline. So, and so, we have these ways of setting up these um, benchmarks in our own particular faith tradition, and that if people achieve that benchmark, it's assumed then that we are mature and therefore reason to have pride because they have it and they do it and nobody else does. Okay, so he goes on to say then, uh, he says, it is no affair of yours whether those theories are true or false. The great thing is to make Christianity a mystery religion in which he feels himself one of the initiates. And so this is exactly what I'm saying, is that you have these people who are leaders in these different faith traditions and denominations who feel as if they hold the keys of the kingdom and that everybody else needs to comport themselves to those keys. And Lewis is saying here, or Screwtape is saying, it doesn't matter whether those keys are true or false. What you just have to do is to get people to believe that they have something that nobody else does, and those people need what they have, and you are the one who dispenses it. You are the one who's aware, and you are the one who's in control, and nobody else really does. And so the worst kind of example that would be a cult leader celebrity pastors can be that way as well. And denominational leaders, man, I've just seen that so many times in different denominations. I've been a part of, I want to say 6 or 7 different denominations, and so many times you see denominational leaders who are like the pit bull. They are the gatekeepers, and the criteria that they employ really isn't biblical. They are hoops that people have to jump through. And as people jump through those hoops, those gatekeepers delight in that kind of control. It's pride, is what it is. He goes on to say, pray do not fill your letters with rubbish about this European war. Its final issue is no doubt important, but that is a matter for the high command. I am not in the least interested in knowing how many people in England have been killed by bombs, in what state of mind they died. I can learn from the office at this end. What they are going to die, that they are going to die sometime, I already knew. Please keep your mind on your work. And so, Lewis, again, you know, we are often deluded and tempted to believing that, the great evil in the world is in the manifestation of things like wars. Lewis would say that's the outcome of really inner evil, that wars can only be fought and people will only die in wars because of that, because there's pride in people's lives first, and because somebody has been offended or because somebody wants something they believe they deserve that nobody else can have. That was certainly Adolf Hitler. And so that war happened because pride came before the fall, a haughty spirit. That's why, on that level, it was the corruption of the inner part of a man who was very powerful, or men who were very powerful, that enable the great outworkings of evil. But all of those great outworkings of evil exist in a nodal point of an individual or individuals And because that's what they are, and they have that much power, then they can they can exact a tremendous amount of evil and suffering in the world in which they live in. So that's what Lewis is talking about here. So that's what I have for you today about this chapter. And again, I would just encourage you to go back to Proverbs and memorize Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And then look up online or in your concordance or whatever other examples of pride. And then pray, Lord, what areas of my life am I prideful about? Uh, it really, pride knows no limit nor bounds. I mean, we tend to think that it's always the wealthy, always the powerful that are prideful. You can have a gutter living drunk who is just as prideful because he thinks he can handle his liquor or better, or he thinks that he can live on the street more effectively than these other people, and so he regards them pridefully or disdainfully. Doesn't matter where you are or what station you have in life, how much or how little you have, pride can always be a controlling and dominant element within our mind and within our heart. So keep that in mind, and don't let this lesson just sit there, but allow it to work on you as I should allow it to work on me, so that we learn from it and we deal with our pride. Because remember, the most beautiful of all the vices is spiritual pride. Thanks again. Make some comments, share this video, and I will see you this Thursday. God bless. Bye-bye.